All right. Good morning, afternoon, whenever you are watching this. Welcome to week 10. We are going to be talking about modern slavery this week, and slavery in general, as well as human trafficking. Now, when I say the word slavery, you probably think that doesn't exist anymore. Well, you would be wrong in thinking that because slavery still does exist. And this week is all about recalibrating our thoughts around what is slavery, and applying that to the real world of what we know goes on throughout the world. So, to start off with, let's kind of do some definitions. And the first definition that we're going to do is the definition of slavery. And slavery is the control of one person by another person for the purposes of economic exploitation, and the person is unable to walk away. Now, I will say that slavery is very limited in its recognition as a crime against humanity. Um, in international law kind of handles slavery a little bit differently than most of our atrocity crimes. So there are four elements of slavery that I want you to make sure you remember. And those elements of slavery are the person is forced to work, they are owned or controlled by an employer, they are dehumanized, treated as a commodity, and there's a restraint on their freedom. They are not able to leave freely. All right, so those elements of slavery again are forced labor, owned, dehumanized, or treated as a commodity, and there's a restraint on their freedoms. So you see the definition that I kind of read to you a little bit earlier. And it's estimated that 40.3 million people are enslaved worldwide. Um, there is differences in the definition, and that kind of explains some of the wide variation in numbers that we get. The 40.3 million is the latest estimate from the International Labor Organization, and although the Human Slavery Index is one of the most cited, it does have some significant methodological problems that likely overestimate the total number of uh, people enslaved. Um, However, we will say, and it is a safe bet to say, that the number of those enslaved is increasing from years gone by. So let's look at some statistics. Um, you will be able, I believe, yes, on the next slide, you'll be able to see this global slavery index. So pay attention to that. But I just want to kind of go over um, some statistics with you. So 71% of females make up the slavery population. And then there are 75% adults and 25% children make up the slavery population. And at least 2.5 million slaves were trafficked. And so we're going to talk about human trafficking here in a little bit. But human trafficking is a form of slavery. 58% of those enslaved live in India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Uzbekistan. And it's estimated that up to 57,700 slaves are currently working in the United States. Here is the visual that I want you to kind of take a look at. And you can, like I said, this is from the Global Slavery Index, and this is 2016 numbers. But you can kind of see where the biggest population comes from and kind of some of the numbers going around. You should be able to see that the Asian Pacific has the majority of the slavery population. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. There is something known as the economics of slavery. So when we are thinking about slavery, we're not thinking just about human trafficking, but there is an economic element to human trafficking because it is using one's body to make money. Um, However, there are forced slavery people, or for people who are forced into slavery, um, that uh, kind of utilizes different industries. And so you can see kind of industrial breakdowns like domestic servitude, agriculture, factories, things like that. It's estimated that $99 billion, um, uh, that slavery is estimated to be worth $99 billion within the industry, with an estimated 21,000 in profit per victim. Uh, 68% of private are private individuals or enterprises. And so we see a lot of slavery happening in agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and domestic work. Profits from slavery are estimated to be over 150 billion. And out of that 150 billion, we see about 8 billion from domestic work, which we'll talk about, 43.4 billion from non-domestic work, and 99 billion from sex trade. And when we start talking about human trafficking, it is important to note that human trafficking happens inside the country that of where they're at. So over 50% of people are enslaved where they live, um, and human trafficking happens there, within in the country. So let's talk about human trafficking. Sorry, I'm writing down timestamps. So, according to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. Now, I want you to pay very special attention to the wording there. When we think about human trafficking, we really think about sex trafficking. So we're thinking about like forced prostitution and things like that. However, notice that there is a labor portion to the definition of human trafficking. Labor trafficking is a real issue, especially here in the United States. As you know, I worked for DFACS before I came to Georgia Southern, and I can tell you that I dealt with a lot of children who were labor trafficked to this country. They were brought to this country specifically to work and pay off the debts of the person bringing them to this country. We're going to talk a little bit more about labor trafficking. But I have a couple of videos throughout this presentation that are embedded. So please make sure that you watch those. I also have those videos up on Folio, and you're going to see the videos like right up in here. It is estimated that millions of people are trafficked worldwide. Human trafficking is not just a United States issue, it is a worldwide issue. In fact, human trafficking, Sorry, writing down timestamps. Human trafficking is one of the greatest threats to human rights this century. It can happen in any community, and victims can be any age, any race, anything like that. But trafficking is a true multi-faceted process. So someone doesn't just fall into trafficking. It is highly organized, and the people who specialize in human trafficking have created processes to recruit and maintain their labor. So you see the processes on your screen: recruitment, transport, coercion, fraud, force. Um, those are the ways that victims continue to be exploited in human trafficking. So, the recruitment phase, you typically see um, people who are very similar to the victims that are being targeted. So, if a trafficker is targeting a 16-year-old female to sex traffic, recruiters are utilized that are 16-year-old females. Um, I've seen that a lot. Um, but then once they fall into the trafficking realm, their identity is taken away from them. Threats of violence happens to keep them there. They are a source of labor for their pimps and things like that. So let's flip this on its head away from sex trafficking and talk about labor trafficking. So this same process happens um, more than you would think. So people coming to this country are recruited, um, transported, and coercive fraud is used a lot of times, saying that you can come here and um, start your new life. We can get you this green card, things like that. And then once you get here, you have to work in a factory uh, to pay off the person who brought you here, but then also to pay off your current debt that you're accruing from being here. So they bring you here from place from your home and put you with people you might not know, and it's like you're an adult being, like, you have your own apartment, you're paying the trafficker um, fees for getting you here, but then also maintaining you, keeping you up in the house. You're paying rent, you're paying food, you're paying all of that. So we see a lot of that happening with labor trafficking. So do you know the signs of trafficking? Well, there is no one side sign of human trafficking. Um, Signs vary, and a lot of them overlap. I do want you to make sure you watch the video, Know the Signs of Human Trafficking. It is very informative, but child welfare, we were trained in law enforcement. Even when I worked in probation, we were trained to spot human trafficking. And we were really looking for kids. We focused a lot on sex trafficking. And so you were looking for kids who um, had new things but didn't have a source of income. I will tell you, there is a high correlation between foster care and human trafficking. So we would see a lot of our kids being trafficked because, one, um, they were easy targets, because they were taken from their families and put in places that they had never been before, around people who may have been easy targets to recruit them into the life. Some of them were trafficked by their own parents. Um, so there are many different signs. Like I said, there isn't one sign that you just say, "Oh my goodness, that person is being trafficked." Um, there are many signs taken together as far as psychological effects, but also kind of economic gains that don't make sense. So make sure you take the time to watch that video. It's going to have a lot of great information on it. So, who are the most vulnerable population to be trafficked? I talked a little bit about this, but trafficking victims typically come from unstable living situations, and they've been victims of different types of abuse before. Um, there is high correlation between juvenile justice or child welfare involvement and trafficking. Um, Undocumented immigrants are at high risk of being trafficked as well, both labor trafficking and sexual trafficking. And then caregivers who use illegal substances um, can be a sign of potential trafficking. Like I said, I've had parents who have utilized their children as means to pay for drugs. They've trafficked their own children, sex trafficked their own children, things like that. Here are some numbers just to kind of um, put into perspective the population that we're talking about. So 51% of identified victims of trafficking are women, 28% are children, and 21% are men. Yes, men can be trafficked. 72% of people are exploited in the sex industry are women. 63% of identified traffickers were men. However, 37% were women. Women can be traffickers as well. And then you see the number of domestically um, trafficked victims. So, what are some elements of human trafficking? So, the biggest element of human trafficking is forced labor. Um, Trafficking, you are not free to leave, and you are the trafficker's property. So it's very distinctive that from exploitative labor. So exploitative labor, you're free to leave, but any money you make goes to someone else. Like you don't get to keep that money. Well, human trafficking is very distinct because it's the freedom of movement. You don't get to leave. You are controlled by someone. Your body is controlled by someone. You are excuse me, you are treated as a commodity, and overall your freedom is restrained. So if you ever have a conversation or this comes up, there is a major difference from exploitative labor and human trafficking, and that is the freedom and the restraints on freedom. Okay. So now that we've talked a little bit about human trafficking, and we have defined kind of like what slavery is and what we're really kind of talking about, let's talk about the different types of modern slavery. So the first type that we're going to talk about is bonded labor or debt bondage. And this basically is the use of a bond or debt to establish control over someone. Um, some workers inherit debt. Like, for example, in South Asia, it's estimated that there are millions of bonded laborers working to pay off their ancestors' debt. You can see estimates as high as 15 to 20 million people are in bondage debt. Some people fall victim to traffickers and recruiters, um, utilizing bonded um, labor, and it's estimated to be as high as 15 to 20 million. So you need to make sure that you kind of circle that, write that down. Debt bondage of migrant laborers in their countries of origin, which often with the support of the labor agencies or employers, can also contribute to situations of debt bondage. Migrant farm workers are especially vulnerable to debt bondage and labor trafficking in and of itself. Um, and these bonded labor is especially problematic um, in like temporary work programs. So I've included this video I want you to kind of watch to get a visual on what we're talking about when we're talking about bonded labor or debt bondage. But in essence, debt bondage is using a debt to establish control. So, like, I have paid for your college, now I own you, and you have to work for me in my factory. Or I have brought you over to the United States from Guatemala, and now you have to work in the field for me um, in exchange for me bringing you over here. Some of these will overlap, I will tell you that. The next type of modern slavery is forced labor or labor trafficking. So debt bondage kind of flows into labor trafficking in a way. But labor trafficking is recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining persons by using physical threats, psychological coercion, abuse of legal processes, deceptions, or other coercive means to compel someone to work. Um, this encompasses a wide range of activities. Um, and once a person's labor is exploited by such means, the person's previous consent or effort to obtain employment with a trafficker becomes irrelevant. Migrants are particularly vulnerable to this form of human trafficking, but individuals may be forced into labor in their own countries as well. So we see like contract slavery, domestic servitude, sex trafficking, forced prostitution, all of that kind of falls into forced labor. I will tell you my personal experiences with labor trafficking is children being brought into the United States from different countries um, under the guise of uh, better better living conditions, things like that, and being put into a quote unquote host home, and that host home making them pay for everything. So, like, they're not family, they're like roommates. So, they have to pay for half of the rent, they have to pay for their own food, their doctor's bills, things like that. So, they spend more time working in factories, which yes, there are some factories who will turn a blind eye um, to underage. They get false documents showing that they're of age when they're really underage, um, and then they don't go to school, um, things like that. They focus on working off that debt for coming over. Some common industries for forced labor are agriculture, domestic work, construction, mining, manufacturing. I will say pay attention to that because manufacturing and agriculture are two huge um, industries where we really see forced labor and labor trafficking happening. You do see it in construction a lot as well, but you really see it in manufacturing and agriculture. The next type of slavery really kind of falls under um, labor trafficking, but I put it as a different type of slavery just to not really confuse you. But it's called contract slavery. And this is false employment contracts to deceive workers into thinking they are signing up for legitimate jobs when they're really not. When people arrive to their place of employment, they're forced to work for no pay, and escaping is nearly impossible. The false contracts are used to avoid criminal charges or to prove that a debt is owed to the slaveholder. Um, so, like, you see contract slavery sometimes with sex trafficking. So, you see these signs that are like models wanted, and then you show up and you think you're signing a modeling contract, and then you're actually going into sex trafficking. And then they utilize that contract by saying, "You're mine, you signed this contract," things like that. Domestic servitude is really kind of what you think it is. It's when we think of slavery in our society, um, historically it has been domestic servitude. So, this is a form of human trafficking in which individual is exploited as a domestic worker in a private residence. Involuntary domestic workers are often underpaid, if paid at all. In some cases, domestic servitude is a product of debt bondage. Individuals, especially women, confront various forms of abuse, harassment, and exploitation. They're usually not free to leave their employment, or their ability to move freely is greatly restricted. Um, it, you will, and you can read kind of what I have on the screen there, but um, this is huge in the Middle East. Um, and we see domestic servitude a lot in the United States by like bringing over nannies or au pairs or something like that. But it really is a form of slavery um, that still is accessible. So finally, we have sex trafficking. I've really kind of gone over sex trafficking. I'm not going to go over it too much. Um, you can kind of see 1 in 5 youth has been a victim of sex or labor trafficking or both. So sex trafficking is highly, highly um, visible in our community and in our communities and in our culture today. Sex trafficking does happen. We see a lot of sex trafficking happen in up and down interstate systems or in cities next to interstate systems. So when we talk about sex trafficking, you think of big cities like Atlanta or something like that. um, I worked in the 11 counties in Northwest Georgia, which are very small rural counties. And I can tell you we had about 1 to 2 sex trafficking cases a month. Um, these are highly common type of cases. And this is, it's becoming an epidemic. You, as we talked about a little earlier, um, if someone gets in for underage sex trafficking, if they are involved in the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system, you see that they're at higher risk for sex trafficking. Um, if substance use kind of has some corollary correlation to sex trafficking involvement and things like that. The next form of slavery is slavery by descent, or what is known as chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the only type of slavery where an individual is considered the legal property of another. And today it typically is found in Africa, specifically Mauritania. Um, and this type of slavery, um, although it is illegal, law enforcement really doesn't enforce that law in African countries. They will return um, those victims back to their owners um, because they still recognize the slavery by descent. And these are just two kind of examples. Slavery's been criminalized in Mauritania since 2007, but that law is not enforced. And in Niger, those born into descent-based slavery are often marginalized. So you you see slavery by descent or chattel slavery really in the African nations and cultures. This is a video on chattel slavery. I'm gonna let you watch it. It's specifically on Mauritania, so that you can kind of get a visual sense of what we're talking about. But those that are enslaved, utilizing the chattel slavery mindset, they're generations because they're born into slavery. Um, Watch this video. It's kind of hard to watch, just knowing that this still happens in our world, but it does. You see a lot of slavery still in Africa, and so I wanted to include this diagram from the Global Slavery Index. You will see that over 9 million people are in enslaved in Africa today. You see forced marriage is 63% and forced labor is 37%. Um, and it's just kind of shocking to see that almost a little over 9 million people are considered slaves in that country alone. So, Africa has the highest rate of modern slavery in the world. It's 7.6 people per 1,000. So when you um, line up 1,000 people, 7.6. So let's round up. 8 of those people are slaves. And Niger and DRC has the highest absolute number of slaves, and they account for a quarter of all people, um, just with those two um, countries inside the African continent themselves. Child soldiers are another form of slavery, uh, and it's a very recent, or not very recent, a very common type of slavery in Africa. A wide range of roles in which children are used in military conflict. So, child soldiers are used in armed combat, spying, ancillary duties such as um, cooking, cleaning, things like that, sending messages. A recent UN report verified that over 8,000 children were used as soldiers in 2020, and another 2,600 children were killed in conflict. So make sure you watch this video as well. Remember, it is these videos are hard to watch. They're not for the faint of heart. I don't know how to show you this information without showing you these type of videos. So make sure you're taking care of yourself as we go through. Africa is not the only place where child soldiers have been utilized. We see. Sorry, guys, hang on one second. Okay, so we see that the Taliban began using and recruiting child soldiers in the 90s. Um, and it's estimated that approximately 33,000 children were killed or maimed in the past 20 years in Afghanistan. Sometimes children are assumed to have affiliation with extremist groups, and we do see a lot more children or young adults who started out as children being recruited into extremist groups. So this is a form of slavery because they are not free to leave their groups. Uh, it's kind of like the mob. Um, they recruit very young and they kind of ingrain and enculturate these kids into violence. Make sure you watch this video as well. It'll give you a little bit more information around ISIS. Um, and child soldiers that are utilized. Okay, so human trafficking globally, you see that there are estimates for about 27 million slaves globally. 20.9 million people are forced labor, bonded labor, forced child labor, and sexual servitude. Africa um, has very high um, concentrations, but the highest concentration is 11.7, so almost 12 million in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Um, you do have state imposed forced labor, and you can see those global estimates there as well. All right, so we've looked. All right, so we've looked at modern slavery throughout the world. And I've given you brief overviews. I'm going to let you kind of dive into a lot of um, the nuts and bolts. The reading this week will help you kind of um, make sense of what we've gone over. But I wanted to spend some time talking about Georgia human trafficking laws. So when we think of modern slavery, the biggest thing that I think of is human trafficking. And Georgia recently, within the past 10 years, updated some of their human trafficking laws. So Georgia defines human trafficking as a crime that focus on the acts of compelling or coercing a person's labor, services, or commercial sexual acts, or using children under the age of 18 for commercial sexual acts. The coercion can be subtle or overt, physical or psychological, but it must be used to coerce a victim into performing labor, services, or commercial sexual acts. The laws against trafficking are rooted in the prohibition against slavery and an involuntary servitude guaranteed by the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And if you are in violation of Georgia's human trafficking laws, it's punishable by a minimum of 10 years in prison, 25 years to life, and a $100,000 fine for sex trafficking of a minor. So it's very important to kind of realize that when we talk about human trafficking, we're talking about sex trafficking, we're talking about labor trafficking, we're talking about all types of modern slavery is truly illegal in the state of Georgia and pretty much in the United States. There's some federal laws that prohibit slavery as well. And again, the 13th Amendment to our Constitution really kind of prohibit slavery. So, like I said, Georgia's law within the past 10 years, and really within the past 3 years, was updated. Um, but Senate Bill 435, Criminal Record Clearing Remedies for Trafficking Survivors, it's also known as the Survivors First Act, and it allows survivors of sex or labor trafficking to clean up their Georgia criminal history. And the reason this is important is because there's been a new revelation that prostitutes are victims, um, a majority of the time. And human trafficking, in recognizing the practice of human trafficking, you have to recognize the victimization that those that are trafficked undergo. And so a lot of these kids or adults, um, are arrested under prostitution laws if it's sex trafficking. And so that means they have criminal records as prostitutes. So, what the Survivors First Act really kind of means and why it was implemented was because we recognize as a state that these are victims. And because they're victims, they're forced into a life of criminality that they might not have wanted or not might not have signed up for. And so they truly are modern slaves. And we were punishing them criminally whenever we should have been protecting them and recognizing them as victims. And so you can see this Survivors First Act really kind of um, helps them and turns the coin and shows them as victims. So it restricts access to their records. It vacates convictions that were a result of the trafficking. And it helps reduce barriers to employment, housing, and kind of other opportunities. All right, so we are at the end of our presentation, and the final uh, probably 3 slides, I think, are all resources for human trafficking. So these resources have federal, community resources, things like that, are places that that victims of trafficking can go to get the help that they need, and that for this slide in particular, federal resources that providers can go to get funding to help them help the victims of trafficking. And they do that through grants and things like that, where the federal government will help fund initiatives and kind of different opportunities for service providers to help this specific population of victims. All right, that's going to conclude this week. You can go through the rest of the PowerPoint if you want to look at the different services and things like that. It will be uploaded. If you need anything, feel free to reach out. There are several videos that I want you to make sure that you watch this week. They are in the materials, as well as some handouts and just some overall. Just go through the other materials. There's some optional resources there that you can look at and things like that. So, if you need anything, feel free to reach out. Hope you all have a great week.